there, my name's Mrs Rust Ashford and I've got a video for you about the Controversies unit in Psychology A2. Unfortunately I've got a bit of a cold, so Margaret, the psychology professor here, is going to take you through the unit. Okay Margaret, take it away. In psychology, there are a number of debates or controversies based on how we study human behaviour, what is considered worthy types of knowledge, and also how scientific or objective we are in our pursuit of the truth about behaviour. All of these controversies affect psychology as a discipline and whether it can be regarded as a science. Firstly, I need to explain the requirements of the controversy section of the paper. You will write one 25-mark essay from a choice of two. The marks are broken down into 3 AO1 marks, 7 AO2 marks, and 15 AO3 marks. AO1 marks are gained for giving an accurate definition of a term with an example. AO2 marks are gained from evaluating and analysing arguments you make. AO3 marks are gained for identifying and explaining arguments or points that demonstrate your understanding of science. To get an AO3 mark, for example, you might say, psychology is scientific because it shares the criteria of science. When it conducts lab experiments, for example, we're doing empirical research, we're objective and we control variables. For example, when Skinner used the Skinner box to gather observations of operant conditioning. Then to get AO2 marks, you would evaluate this argument by perhaps saying, on the other hand, some may argue that lab experiments in psychology are not entirely scientific since they are still affected by issues like researcher bias or demand characteristics, which affect the validity of the studies. Plants, for example, don't choose how to react to rain, they just grow. So we can do scientific experiments to show how water affects plants. But can we do the same for human behaviour? Maybe not. This suggests that psychology is not as scientific in the true sense. Here you can see that what you've done is demonstrated your understanding of how science works, but you've also evaluated and analysed your argument. Now for the debates themselves. The first, and possibly most fundamental, is whether or not psychology can be regarded as a science. To assess this argument, we need to know what being a science really means. So we need to know the criteria we would use to call something scientific. We can then look at the approaches in psychology to see if they're scientific or not. Consider the difference between the biological and psychodynamic approaches. Another important aspect of this debate is whether or not it's actually right for psychology to be strictly scientific. Many psychologists argue that if it were, we would have to ignore the uniqueness of individuals, for example, or their free will, and also perhaps simply what works in improving lives, such as psychoanalytic theories for helping people with mental disorders. If we use an example of Gerald, a person with schizophrenia, if we stick to a strictly scientific method, the only therapy available to Gerald might be for him to take drugs to restrict his levels of dopamine. The next debate or controversy is the extent to which our behaviour is the result of genes or the environment. Behaviour is the result of an interaction between the two, probably, but which is more important? The study of the human genome has revealed many more genetic influences than we once thought, but it's almost impossible to isolate genetic influences from environmental ones. We only need to look at feral children to see the catastrophic results of children who grow up in isolation from other humans. But still, we can't establish that the environment is the only thing that matters. Even many mental disorders may have a genetic basis, so the debate goes on. A key point is if we focus too heavily on one aspect, we become reductionist, and therefore we're not finding the full truth. Take our example of Gerald again. If we say his schizophrenia is due to his genes, then we ignore environmental factors such as his family or other factors which may impact on him. Next, we have the important question of whether scientific progress in psychology is worth some of the ethical dilemmas it presents. On the one hand, we have an obligation to do research to benefit humankind. For example, Milgram identified how situational and social factors can cause destructive obedience, but the ethical costs of his research were severe. We need to strike a balance between the two. Deception may be necessary to find valid results, but we must weigh up usefulness of the information gained. The small amount of deception in Loftus and Palmer, for example, resulted in useful findings for eyewitness testimony. Is it worth unethical experiments on animals to help Gerald with schizophrenia, for example? The last two controversies are related to how objective we can be in psychology. If it is a science, it should be objective in all its endeavours, and yet closer examination reveals both gender and cultural biases in research and theory. Is it possible? It's not possible for us to remove our values when we conduct research. And so therefore we may produce theories based on sexist or racist assumptions. Even more sinister is the idea that psychological research could be used with the sole purpose of discriminating against certain groups to encourage a political outcome. For example, suggesting that children who don't get enough affection from their mothers will turn out mentally unstable or delinquent is gender biased and encourages women to sacrifice careers in favour of child rearing. Research which ignores subtle cultural differences can likewise result in racist conclusions. Unless these biases are identified, psychology could do more harm than good. In our example, if we were to change Gerald to Geraldine, we would find that she was more likely to be diagnosed with a mental illness in the first place. Likewise, if Gerald were black, he would be 4 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia than if he was white. There is one more debate that I would like to discuss with you. This one is one that you're not actually going to study in your PY4 Controversies unit, but it is nevertheless an important debate, and you can use it in your other PY4 essays. This debate is about free will and determinism. The goal of psychology is to discover causes of human behaviour. Therefore, by its very nature, it's deterministic, since it believes there must be something causing all forms of action. For example, positive reinforcement causes things to be repeated, or a gene causes schizophrenia. Can we therefore eventually document and describe every cause of every action or behaviour? No, we can't. Why? Because the different choices people make are many, and the multiple of influences in their lives, we can't possibly discover them all. Complete determinism is impossible to prove, and we can't eliminate every possible other explanation for every action. This is only one problem. Another is we can't ignore the existence of free will. If every action is determined by a cause, this would imply we have no free will. But this doesn't feel right to us. Furthermore, coming to the conclusion that free will doesn't exist would be bad for society. Think, no one would be responsible for their crimes. A psychopath might be seen as not responsible. He's just a victim of bad brain structure. Also, presumably, no one could choose to influence their lives in a positive way. So success at school could no longer be down to individual choice, but only a set of determining factors like upbringing or genetic influence. These are fundamental questions for how we choose to proceed with psychology. Also, Gerald, to go back to our example, surely has to freely choose to go to therapy in order for him to get better. These are the controversies in Psychology A2 PY4. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Bye!